2,000 years before modern pharma, India built a medical industry so advanced it exported doctors, drugs, and surgical techniques across Asia. Ayurveda, the science of life, was not just a healing tradition. It was a thriving commercial sector, with medical schools, salaried physicians, and a global trade in medicinal plants. In this episode of Empires and Economics, the physician's fee structure of ancient India, the medical schools of Taxila and Nalanda, the export trade in medicines from cinnamon to sandalwood, and the business of the world's first plastic surgeons. This is the story of Ayurveda, how India turned healing into an industry, and how that industry changed the world. I'm your host, and this is Empires and Economics. To understand Ayurveda's economics, start with geography. India sat at the center of the ancient world's trade networks, with ports on the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean routes that connected Rome, Persia, and China. And India had something the rest of the world desperately wanted: medicine. The subcontinent's forests and mountains produced a pharmacopoeia unmatched anywhere on Earth: pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, sandalwood, and hundreds of medicinal plants that could not be grown anywhere else. The demand was enormous. Roman emperors paid fortunes for Indian spices and remedies. Persian courts imported Indian physicians. Chinese emperors sent envoys to study Indian medicine. But Ayurveda was not just a collection of remedies. It was a profession, organized, regulated, and priced like any other industry. The first thing to understand about Ayurveda is that doctors charge for their services, and the fees were written into the medical texts themselves. The Charaka Samhita, the great medical encyclopedia compiled around the 1st century AD, is explicit about money. A physician should charge according to the patient's wealth and the difficulty of the case. The poor should be treated for free, but the rich should pay generously. Charaka even gives the reasoning. A physician who charges nothing is not trusted, because people assume free treatment is worthless. The fee was part of the therapy. The Sushruta Samhita, the surgical text, goes further. It instructs the surgeon to demand payment before the operation, because after a successful surgery, the patient might forget his gratitude. And the Arthashastra, Kautilya's manual of statecraft from the 4th century BC, regulates medical prices like any other trade. It sets the fees for physicians, the wages of medical students, and the penalties for malpractice. A doctor who treated a patient badly could be fined, or worse. Medicine in ancient India was a profession with a price list. The fees were substantial. A successful physician in a major city could earn more than a government official, and the best doctors were retained by kings at salaries that made them among the wealthiest men in the kingdom. The Arthashastra records that royal physicians were paid from the treasury, with generous allowances for their households. In return, they were expected to treat the king, his family, and his army, and to report any sign of poisoning or disease that might threaten the state. But the real money was in private practice. The medical texts describe physicians traveling between towns, building reputations, and charging according to their fame. A doctor with a name could name his price. The economics were simple. Healing was a scarce skill, and India had made it a profession. Where did these physicians come from? The answer is the great medical schools, and the most famous was Taxila. Taxila, in the northwest of the subcontinent, was one of the world's first universities. Students came from across India, Persia, and even Greece to study medicine, surgery, and the sciences. The curriculum took 7 years, and the training was rigorous. The economics of medical education were well established. Students paid tuition, often in the form of service to their teacher. The Charaka Samhita describes the students' obligations: to serve the master, to gather herbs, to assist in treatment, and to pay the final fee when the training was complete. The teacher, in turn, was obligated to teach the complete science, holding nothing back. The relationship was formalized in a ceremony, almost like a contract, in which the student promised to live a life of discipline and the teacher promised to reveal the full art. By the 5th century AD, the center of gravity had shifted to Nalanda, the greatest university of the ancient world. Nalanda was enormous. Chinese pilgrims described 10,000 students and monks, supported by the revenues of 200 villages granted by the kings. The university had 9-story libraries, lecture halls, and dormitories, and it was free. The state funded Nalanda. The students paid nothing. Their food, lodging, and education were provided by the royal endowment. In return, the university produced the physicians, scholars, and administrators who served the empire. This was medical education as state investment. The kings understood that a healthy population was a productive population, and that a university producing doctors was worth more than a treasury full of gold. The model worked. Nalanda's graduates spread across Asia, carrying Ayurvedic knowledge to Tibet, China, and Southeast Asia, and the reputation of Indian medicine grew with them. Medicine was not just practiced in India, it was exported. The Indian Ocean trade carried Ayurvedic remedies to every corner of the ancient world. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a first-century Greek sailing guide, lists the cargoes: spikenard, costus, bdellium, lycium, and other medicinal plants shipped from Indian ports to the Roman Empire. The trade was enormous. The Roman author Pliny complained that India and Arabia were draining the empire of 100 million sesterces a year, much of it spent on spices and drugs. Indian pepper was so valuable it was used to pay ransoms and taxes. The medicinal plant trade created a supply chain that stretched across 3 continents. Indian herbs were carried by ship to the Red Sea, overland to the Nile, and up to Rome. They were carried by caravan through Persia to the markets of the Middle East, and they were carried by junk across the Bay of Bengal to China. The scale is hard to overstate. Indian physicians and remedies were known in Rome. The emperor's own doctors included Indians. Persian kings employed Indian physicians at court, and when the Chinese emperor wanted the best medical knowledge, his envoys traveled to India to get it. The export economy worked both ways. India imported gold, silver, and luxury goods, and exported medicine, spices, and knowledge. The balance of trade ran heavily in India's favor for centuries, and the trade was not just in raw plants. India exported finished medicines, compounded remedies, medicated oils, and surgical instruments. The brand name Indian medicine was itself a selling point across the ancient world. The most remarkable part of the Ayurvedic industry was surgery, and the most remarkable surgeon was Sushruta. Sushruta, who lived around the 6th century BC, is often called the father of surgery. His Samhita describes more than 100 surgical instruments: scalpels, forceps, catheters, needles, and probes, and more than 300 surgical procedures. The most famous was rhinoplasty, the reconstruction of the nose. Sushruta's technique, using a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead, is still the basis of modern plastic surgery. The British surgeon who rediscovered the technique in the 18th century learned it from an Indian text. Surgery was big business. The Sushruta Samhita is explicit about the fees. The surgeon should be paid before the operation, and the fee should reflect the patient's means. A king's surgery cost a fortune. A poor man's was done for free. The training was equally practical. Sushruta students practiced incisions on gourds and leather, learned to tie knots, and made their own instruments. The goal was a surgeon who could operate with confidence and precision, because the penalty for failure was severe. The Arthashastra and the medical texts both describe the malpractice rules. A surgeon who operated without skill could be fined, and in the worst cases, the punishment was mutilation. The profession policed itself because the reputation of the whole industry depended on it. The result was a surgical tradition that astonished foreign visitors. Greek and Chinese accounts describe Indian surgeons performing operations that were unknown in their own lands: cataract surgery, lithotomy, and reconstructive procedures that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. Ayurveda did not stay in India. It became the foundation of medical systems across Asia. In Persia, Indian physicians were employed at the Sasanian court, and Ayurvedic texts were translated into Pahlavi. In the Islamic world, the great physician Avicenna drew on Indian medicine, and his canon in turn shaped European medicine for 500 years. In Tibet, Ayurveda became the basis of the Tibetan medical tradition, which survives to this day. In China, Indian medical texts were translated and studied, and Chinese travelers brought back Indian remedies and techniques. The spread was driven by economics as much as by science. Indian physicians were valuable exports, kings competed to attract them, and the trade in medical knowledge followed the trade in medical goods, and the industry never died. Ayurveda continued to be practiced, taught, and exported for 2,000 years through the Mughal period, through British rule, and into the present day. Today, Ayurveda is a global industry worth billions of dollars. Indian herbal remedies are sold on every continent. The same plants that filled the ships of the Roman trade, turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, are now packaged in capsules and sold in pharmacies from New York to Tokyo. The business model is the same one the Charaka Samhita described 2,000 years ago: a skilled healer, a paying patient, and a remedy worth more than the plant it came from. The lesson of Ayurveda is that medicine was never just a science, it was an economy. India built the first medical industry because it had the resources, the knowledge, and the market. It trained its physicians, priced their services, exported their remedies, and spread their techniques across the world. The physicians of ancient India understood something that modern healthcare is still learning: that healing is a profession, and professions run on economics. The fees, the schools, the trade, the surgery, it all added up to an industry that outlasted every empire that tried to control it. Ayurveda is not a relic of the past, it is one of the longest-running businesses in human history, a medical economy that has been operating continuously for more than 2,000 years. And that is the real miracle of the science of life. not that it healed the sick, but that it built an industry that never stopped.